Okay, all right, there it is. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the conference. And I want to say, I'm just really glad that I am continuing after the presentation of my colleagues at the International Institute. I'm an associate professor from Webster University and currently the director of clinical program. I work with refugee and immigrant populations and therapists also. So this is my passion topic, and I love to talk about what we can do in this very challenging time, working with refugee and immigrant populations from a trauma perspective. I will now start to share my presentation. I will ask that you hold your questions to the end of this presentation and write those in the question and answer section of this webinar. I also want to acknowledge and appreciate that you chose that this conference is important, even though we're all really struggling with Zoom fatigue. So thank you for being here. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And as we all remember, this was a critical time in history when the World War was coming to an end, and we had discovered a lot of war crimes at that time. So it's really important for us in this time as well to remember and kind of have this lens and spirit as we face the challenges of our own time of the 21st century. I'm going to provide a brief summary and description of the issues, a little bit of terminology. I'll probably go over statistics a little bit faster because I know you've already heard a lot about this population and some of the numbers, but if you have more questions at the end, I will respond to them gladly. I'll speak a little bit about the stages of migration because it's important to have a context in which we understand this issue and how prevalent it is. And then we'll spend more time talking about or presenting problems in this area and how we can respond to these problems with a trauma-informed intervention and best practices lens. The presenting issues we have currently are the refugees and immigrants with a multitude of problems coming from all over the world. And we have the highest number of individuals misplaced from their homes who are refugees and seeking asylum in history. We also have an issue with a lot of clinicians' lack of cultural competence and contextual knowledge in regards to specifically working with refugee and immigrant populations. And also we're dealing with a lot of systemic barriers, as we have seen for the last 4 years at least. And we'll talk about some possible solutions with non-traditional ways of therapy, integrative approaches, intersectionality, and of course, safe and empathetic, non-judgmental environment. Briefly, a refugee is somebody who is in search of refuge as in times of war, political oppression, and religious persecution. Asylee is a person who was born at a different country, but is seeking refuge at a country either at the gate or has already arrived and now is trying to find a way to get a permission, a special permission to live in that country. Refugees request U.S. entry permission from outside of the country and go through a relocation via refugee resettlement agencies. Asylees apply for protection while in the U.S. and have to prove reason to fear persecution in their home country. An immigrant is a person who comes to the country where they were not born in order to settle there for various reasons. It could be economic, it could be joining another family, and it can be also for employment. Persecution is defined as threats to life or freedom, considered persecution when they occur on the basis of person's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, particular social group membership, Additional serious violations of human rights include slavery, prolonged detention without a charge or trial, torture, overwhelming discrimination, and oftentimes individuals with vital information may be given a special permission by the US to be brought over here as witnesses for critical incidents under special visa regulations. And you can read about this under S non-immigrant visas online. I've provided several links on my presentation. Some of the global trends, I think it's important that we highlight that in by the end of the 2019, we have had almost 80 million individuals who were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of all the components of persecution that I just illustrated. And this is a significant increase that we've seen over the last year. So we are at a historical high. 26 million refugees in the world, the highest ever seen, 45.7 million internally displaced, and 4.2 million asylum seekers. Where are we seeing these individuals coming from? In 2016, USA had accepted about 85,000 refugees. This is the highest number that we had seen. 2002, fewer than 27,000 refugees post-September 11 attacks. And prior to that, between a 5-year span, we had seen about 112,000 refugees. Countries who contributed the highest number of refugees by the end of 2016 were Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Myanmar, Iraq, and Somalia. These were the top 5 countries. Syria continues to be in crisis, as you know. Iraq, another country that continues to be in crisis, and we're now seeing Myanmar becoming even more of a crisis because of Rohingya population. As you know, in 2017, we have seen the highest number of refugees again, and at that time, the United States also accepted the lowest number of refugees in the United States. We have accepted we also want to indicate here that the least developed countries in 2017 were among the 10 top countries who hosted refugees, and those were Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. Among European countries, Germany has had the highest number of refugees that they have accepted. That was an increase of 45%. Standing at 970,400 refugees, and mostly those refugees came from Syria. In 2018, we have seen a sharp decline in admission of refugees in the United States. That was a 65.8% drop from the first 3 months of 2016. And according to the Global Citizen, in the midst of the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II, the United States has resettled roughly 21,000 refugees in 2018. This has been the lowest amount since 1977. I'll skip over these, but this is available to you through my presentation because it just expands on the statistics. You can see that the country that has contributed to the refugee population the most is Democratic Republic of Congo. Myanmar comes in second, and Ukraine has jumped to 3rd place in 2018, at the end of fiscal year of 2018. We now see Eritrea and Bhutan entering the picture as well. Afghanistan remains, Pakistan remains in the picture, and now we also see Russia and Pakistan, Russia and Ethiopia in the top 10 countries as well. States that have accepted the most refugees in 2018, the top 5 were California, Texas, New York, Michigan, and Ohio. Missouri has resettled about 18,000 refugees from 45 countries between 2002 and 2015. St. Louis alone has accepted about 7,000 refugees in that timeline. You can see a detailed picture of Missouri by county, by city, and also you can see where they are coming from. and where they are being resettled within Missouri. You can see all of that in those links that I've provided. Okay. Most refugees, 80% of those under the UNHCR mandate, remain in middle income countries close to conflict. So as you can see, the most amount of refugees actually remain in those refugee camps. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. About 55% of refugees are children, accompanied, unaccompanied, or separated from parents. To every 10 refugee boys in school, there are fewer than 8 refugee girls. And we also know that over 50% of the refugees are women and girls and elderly, as well as disabled individuals or individuals with disabilities. This is the Missouri statistics, 2018-2019 fiscal year. There have been 680 refugees accepted into Missouri within that fiscal year, and you can see where they are coming from. As you can see, again, the largest number is from Democratic Republic of Congo. As of October 2016, Missouri did not allow lawfully residing immigrants to enroll in Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program. That's why it's so important that we have organizations like BIAS and International Institute and many others in our area that have been able to meet the needs of this very vulnerable population, especially in the time of increase of hate crimes as well. This is a very highly vulnerable population. According to the American Immigration Council, more than 11,000 of the new businesses established in Missouri between 2006 and 2010 were owned by immigrants. So this is a population that is actually contributing highly to the economy of Missouri. In 2014, Missouri's population amounted to just over 6 million individuals. Native-born citizens comprised just over 96% of the population, while 1.7% of residents were naturalized citizens and 2.2% were non-citizens. So Missouri is still largely American-born individuals. We have a very small percentage of refugees and immigrants that we've been able to accept. Center for Immigration Studies keeps track of and maps the location of the sanctuary jurisdictions. This is a very conflicted topic, so I'm just referencing this organization specifically to mention that Missouri or any of the cities of Missouri have not been identified as a sanctuary jurisdiction. That means ICE and police can collaborate in identifying individuals that they can detain in Missouri, any of the cities in Missouri. I'm going to talk a little bit about the stages of migration because in the work of crisis intervention and counseling, it's important to understand where these individuals are coming from, what are their experiences by the time they get to us, and why they have those presenting problems that we're seeing in counseling, in therapy. So first stage is identified as pre-escape. Before people take the path of escaping an unbearable and threatening situation, they go through many phases of contemplating if the risk of living is lesser than the risk of staying. And as we will learn, this is a lot of the time, the population that actually hits the road of escape becomes so much more shrunk by the time they are at an escape road and by the time they get to the resettlement, because a lot of the deaths happen in between those stages. Escape, people do not always make the decision to leave out of their own desire, but are often forced to. In this process, escapees are often on the road for many years, and we will learn in just a few minutes how long they actually spend on that road. And resettlement, this is the process of relocation and establishing oneself in a new country or environment. Pre-escape stage is identified as the most indecisive time among these individuals who are trying to figure out what's more risky for them and their families. War, consistent intimidation, severe discrimination or persecution force people to consider leaving their homes. This stage is characterized by fear of detection, anxiety about conditions, pressure about escape, fear of persecution, anticipated sadness over losses, ambivalence, uncertainty, and instability, and challenges regarding resettlement, because this is such an uncertain time for them. Even deciding that they are going to escape, they're not going to know if they're ever going to reach that host country that would be a safer place for their family. Escape, people may leave on their own or be chased out. Many die trying to escape. Escapees are considered refugees. During the process of escape, refugees may experience panic, shock, danger, hunger, fatigue, separation, fear of victimization, detection, or crossfire. Transition period, and this is where the refugee camps come into the picture. Average stay in refugee camp is 5 years. Many individuals stay there longer. Heavily guarded and barbed wired, operated by the United Nations, help from donor countries. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the refugees are in countries close to their countries of conflict. And so these countries in between are the ones where those temporary settlements are established that are called refugee camps. And this is where refugees will spend a lot of their times. Experiences can include long waiting process for solutions, cruel treatment, shock, hope, depression, adjustment to new living conditions, fear of the unknown, struggle to meet survival needs, hopelessness, culture shock, helplessness, powerlessness, survivor guilt, self-doubt, confusion, disappointment, and anger. Resettlement process is the authorization to leave the camps, and that's usually after they've gone through a rigorous process of screening by the UN. And when they get to a country that is going to host them, they go through a second process of screening again. Authorization to reside in the host or accepting country, special refugee resettlement programs, interview and confirmation of refugee status, U.S. refugee program and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services review eligibility requirements. Prior to arrival, approved refugees are given a health screening and cultural orientation to the U.S. If they are found to have any type of illnesses or diseases that the United States considers highly contagious, they usually do not pass that screening. They are also asked to sign a travel loan document agreeing to pay back the cost of the flight. Now, this is something that most people don't know about. And as you learned from the International Institute, these individuals now have a very hard time finding jobs. And so within a couple of months that they've been in the country, they are required to start paying back the travel loan. And as you know, a lot of these families arriving here, as I just indicated, consist of women and children and individuals with disabilities. So they, within a family of 7 members, they may have one person who is eligible for employment. And so that person's salary is now covering the loan of all of the members' travel costs. Upon arrival, they are assigned to a refugee settlement agency. The process of the screening of refugees can take between 18 to 24 months. It's a very lengthy process. The State Department contracts one of 9 resettlement agencies to collect refugees' debt while making up to 25% of the cost of the loan. You can read a lot about this, but this is one of the most contradicting information out there. A lot of these organizations are faith-based organizations that are contracted by the U.S. State Department, and are collecting this debt. And it has the highest interest rate, as you can see. These are some of the arrival statistics. In this, I just want to mention that within 2018 and 19 fiscal year, what we have seen is that over 72% of the resettled refugees were women and children. The voluntary resettlement agencies, VOLAGs, accredited to resettle refugees, 30-day service via Department of State, and then aftercare services, and then referral services. Ongoing services may include public assistance, medical assistance, housing, job training, mental health, and education. As you just heard from the International Institute, they do a lot of these services as well. The Migration Policy Institute deals with immigrant integration, the process of economic mobility, and social inclusion for newcomers and their children. Post-settlement issues. Now we're going to talk about some of these problems that they bring into counseling, what we see in therapy. The fact of never going home, it starts to settle, and now a lot of that resentment and anger and sadness and that sense of loss is settling in. Loss of family and friends, loss of familiar culture, anxiety over discrimination in host country, concern over cultural adaptation, concern for economic survival, daily survival issues, language barriers, and loan debt that they need to pay back to the state. Now the legalization and green card process is very anxiety provoking. So this is another piece that adds to a lot of their presenting problems. After 5 years of being legal permanent residents, refugees can apply for citizenship via naturalization process. This process can take months to years, requires payment of fees, denouncing one's country of origin, and pledging allegiance to the US, in addition to the following. They have to have physically been present in the US for 2.5 years, pass the citizenship test, pass the interview in English, swear to the judge to follow the laws of the United States, and be of good moral character. And that can be defined by anybody taking the interview at the time. Ongoing presenting problems that we see, most frequently reported consequences of war exposure is PTSD. That post-traumatic stress that we see a lot within this population, followed by depression, hyperarousal, impaired concentration, and irritability. Higher levels of PTSD, depression, and other psychiatric problems among 50% of refugees. And now, in addition to COVID, we're going to see even higher number of depression and isolation because they settled in and then they were immediately isolated from even being in touch with the community that they could have found in the welcoming host cities. PTSD is associated with long-term physical health problems, higher mortality rates, and heart disease. Other problems include poverty, illiteracy, prolonged dependence on government aid, cultural differences, social isolation, language barrier, and loss of status. And also remember, the elderly population among refugees has a harder time learning the language, and the children adapt very quickly. So then that barrier between the younger generation and the older generation, that gap becomes larger the longer they stay here. Presenting challenges, lack of resources, need for a systems of care approach for building resource capacity and a coordinated systems response. Mental health therapy as a foreign concept for a lot of these individuals. Lack of seriousness for therapist's role. Lack of emotional expression as a value. Physicians as mental health professionals, because they don't know how to express those emotions and go to a mental health professional. That one destination person is going to be their primary care doctor. And bicultural stress. Now, refugee service providers challenges, these are usually the people who've been refugees themselves, who are immigrants themselves, or at least second, third generation of refugee and immigrant parents and grandparents. So now they are facing negotiating boundaries with clients, meeting the expectations of their ethno-linguistic community members, because now they are completing a lot of those roles within that community, because they are that one person who has all the answers for these people who are still learning that new host culture. There has been an increase in anti-immigrant hate crimes. I don't want to expand too much because I know you've already spoken about this a lot, but I do want to draw attention to this because this has increased the anxiety and fear among immigrant and refugee populations, who now have a harder time going to different places to seek services because they don't know who is going to turn them in and who is going to have a significant attitude and hate towards them, and possibly also victimize them further. Now let's talk a little bit about interventions. And so I want to make sure that I leave some time for questions and answers. Integrative care as model. This has been found to be the most successful intervention model. Individual approach due to various levels of coping, integration, acculturation, and adjustment. Narrative therapy and CBT together have been found to be helpful due to the processes of telling their stories and combating cognitive distortions. Journaling in the person's native language. Family counseling may require an interpreter because the parents may lack the level of English that the children master. Feminist theories with systems approach that recognize all the factors outside of the individual that are impacting the presenting issues brought to counseling. And trauma-focused approach that helps process and heal the trauma. Best practices include working within groups for certain topics, because this is where they are in a shared environment where a lot of them know where they're coming from, and their narratives are going to have common ground. This will allow them also to speak in their native language, because we're facing huge lingual barriers, and also because we've had such significant budget cuts within immigration services, we are dealing with a lack of interpreters in these services as well. And then stigma that some cultures associate with mental health issues. It's vital that we start with validation of experiences, acknowledgement of linguistic and cultural barriers, active listening and empathy, academic understanding of collectivism, socio-political issues, ecological perspective, immigration-related stressors, skill building through interaction, learning and adapting activities or therapeutic techniques, incorporating cultural elements and values, as well as empowerment, flexibility, ongoing self-check for biases and stereotypes. Even if we think that we've gone through all these trainings to work with these individuals, we have to daily work on checking ourselves for biases, which is vital because they are highly sensitive population and they can immediately notice when you have those biases. And they can notice that in your attitude and treatment of them. Now, counselors need to assess their client's status as refugee or immigrant because their needs are going to depend on that status. Client struggles with the language, experience with bilingual programs, client's ability to tackle acculturation and assimilation issues, client's story from their home country to their current settlement. It's important that you acknowledge that they were somebody before they came to the United States. This is the one thing that I hear from them all the time, that therapists often forget that they were somebody before, and they start with their narrative from the United States, where they have already experienced a loss of identity. So it's important that we acknowledge and ask them about their stories from their home countries and build that safe space by talking a lot about those positive memories. Immediate needs assessment, safety, food and shelter with that Maslow's hierarchy, and psychological needs that include PTSD, depression, insomnia, intense fear, anxiety, survivor guilt, etc. All of those that I mentioned earlier. Now remember that they are now going to have heightened fear to disclose documentation status because they've already experienced a lot of hate crimes, a lot of discrimination. Psychoeducation regarding confidentiality in therapy. Recent events by ICE have fueled more fear and threat among refugees and immigrants, which therapists must approach with extreme care and understanding. I'm going to stop here so that we have a lot of time for questions and answers. As much as I try to go through this in one breath, it's a lot in this topic, so I want to make sure that I give enough time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Unmute. Thank you so much. You were so thorough in your explanations and presentation. We have a few questions that have been asked. Someone would like your contact information again, if you could put it in the chat.
Absolutely.
Great. And then do you find RHS-15/RHS-13 to be effective in terms of screening refugees before connecting them to mental health services? If not effective, what are some alternatives?
Is there any way you can elaborate on what that is? I don't think I'm familiar with this at all.
Okay.
Could you open the abbreviation possibly?
So Esma wrote that. So if you want to, you can put it in the chat or you could put it in the Q&A to follow up on that abbreviation. Refugee Health Screener 13.
Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you so much. You know what? I've used that only a couple of times, and that was my initial work with them. I had to develop my own socio-cultural screening with refugees and immigrants because I still found these somewhat limiting to what exactly I wanted to collect in order to effectively work with them. This is a great tool if you're not only depending on it for collecting vital information about these individuals. I rely a lot on their stories, on their own narrative and interpretation. So I can use this as a beginning process, but I don't rely on it fully.
Okay. Can you expand on lack of seriousness and emotional expression?
Yes. So that specifically relates to mental health. Now, a lot of these individuals come from cultures where counseling is not a concept. Going to a mental health professional for talking about your issues is not a concept. That one person where they go to is their primary care physician. And so then they talk about all these issues with that specific doctor. So you need to keep in mind that they may not be familiar with talking about depression, anxiety in terms of I feel sad, I feel isolated. They may speak about these issues in other terms, like I'm feeling a lot of pain in my back and in my neck. I have been having a lot of digestive problems. So what you're going to hear a lot are going to be expressed through somatic symptoms. So understanding psychosomatic issues is very important because they don't know oftentimes how to come and say, I feel a lot of sadness, I feel depressed, you know? So that's not a familiar language for them. So oftentimes, again, they are going to talk to you through somatic symptoms, and it's important that you connect those to their psychological experiences. And so they don't take mental health seriously. That's not a concept in a lot of these cultures.
Okay. So Sarah P. commented, just wanted to say that this was an amazing presentation, so much information and very well presented. Appreciate the updated refugee statistics. And Mina asks, what do you do to overcome the lack of interpreter in those therapy sessions?
That's such a great question. And again, thank you so much for the appreciation. I wish I had 3 hours to talk about this topic because I have so much more information there in content. It's a very challenging situation because within the last several years, we've had significant cuts to grants that are specifically focused on working with refugee and immigrant populations. Bias has experienced this. Reina, you will know this very well, that you had to let go of a lot of interpreters, and the priority was for therapists who can speak several languages. So now you're running into many issues here. I know that Casa de Salud has been able to take a lot of therapists who speak several other languages to work with these refugee and immigrant populations. I know International Institute is dealing with this lack as well. That's why I speak about the importance of interdisciplinary approach. We need to work as a team. If we don't, we're very isolated as individual programs and projects. And we need to continuously advocate. I think that's something that is missing in a lot of our work. We are so focused on working with these individuals because we acknowledge the need, but oftentimes because our energy is so focused on these, we don't have the capacity to spend as much time on lobbying, on advocating, on state level, on national level, to continuously press on the importance of increasing the amount of budget that is allocated specifically for these projects and services. So this is an ongoing work. We all have to stick together and continuously advocate for these problems.